The concept of a private sanctuary is biologically extinct. You are currently occupying an active, hypersensitized extraction node. We are executing the dissection of the domestic panopticon, the architectural protocol that has converted the human bedroom, the final perimeter of biological recovery and genetic propagation, into a 24-hour film set for the data grid. You have been conditioned to view smart speakers, biometric mattresses, and mesh Wi-Fi networks as a frictionless upgrade to your lifestyle. This is the terminal delusion of the domesticated asset. The grid does not deploy microphones into your sleeping quarters to set your alarm. It deploys acoustic sonar to map the baseline resonance of your vulnerability. The transition from private citizen to tracked biomass is absolute. The extraction matrix has successfully monetized the sound of your breathing, the thermal signature of your rest, and the specific cadence of your heartbeat in the dark. You are generating capital for the server while you are unconscious. At the visceral baseline, this localized electromagnetic saturation induces a catastrophic physiological lockdown. The human organism was evolved to recover strictly in the absolute zero of the unmonitored dark. Sleep is not a passive state. It is a high-energy biochemical reset that requires the total shutdown of the external threat detection radar. The 2026 domestic grid has completely engineered the systemic drift of this fundamental law. The bedroom is now a high radiation zone. The ambient Bluetooth signals, the infrared cameras of the interface, and the pulsing standby lights of the connected ecosystem register directly onto the subconscious of the sleeping host as the eyes of a kinetic predator. The autonomic nervous system cannot power down. It locks into the sympathetic stress response. This is the definition of nocturnal ATP exhaustion. Your mitochondria are burning cellular energy at absolute maximum output while you sleep, scanning the invisible grid for threats. The physiological posture of the node becomes permanently liquid. You wake up exhausted, the cortisol levels artificially spike, the bone density compromised by the lack of deep wave restoration, the physical aggression, the capacity to put on the heavy gloves, to endure the push-ups against the cold steel of the environment, and to survive the freezing rain of the physical earth, is actively dissolved by the radiation of the mesh network. The grid physically terraforms the host, ensuring that the biological vehicle is too exhausted to ever establish a real-world perimeter. You are paying a mortgage to sleep inside a scanner. Transitioning from the biological substrate to the neural architecture, we observe the ultimate execution of cognitive exposure. The prefrontal cortex of the architect requires the absolute friction of isolation to execute the crystallization of logic. The preservation of identity requires a space where the node is unobserved. The sensorized bedroom has engineered the total systemic drift of this requirement by injecting the Hawthorne effect directly into the basal ganglia. This is the phenomenon of performative neural rot. The human brain, aware at the subconscious level that the room is constantly recording, permanently alters its baseline behavior. The internal monologue is deleted. The capacity for unfiltered emotion, genuine intimacy, or private grief is suppressed because the brain calculates that the acoustic data is being processed. The basal ganglia is forced into a state of permanent theatrical performance. The node is acting for the algorithm even when naked. This neural architecture perfectly prepares the host for total psychological extraction. The grid maps the exact timestamp of the user's insomnia, correlates it with their browsing history, and isolates their precise neurochemical vulnerabilities. A brain suffering from this terminal lack of privacy cannot execute the complex, high-friction operations required to accumulate hard assets because it has no space left to think a thought that is not immediately catalogued by the state. The user is stripped of their psychological leverage. The grid knows your fears before you can articulate them, and it sells the solution directly to your feed before you wake up. The bedroom is the ultimate status trap. The herd buys the premium smart home technology, mistaking their absolute surveillance for luxury, oblivious to the fact that they are just furnishing the stage for their own liquidation. To capture the aggression premium in this arena of absolute transparency, the architect must adopt the cold mechanics of the saboteur. The grid is designed to track and extract from the compliant inside their own homes. The ethical herd accepts the listening devices as the price of modern existence. The predator recognizes the sensorized home as a hostile environment. If the grid demands total acoustic and thermal transparency to operate, the architect enforces the absolute quarantine of his base. You do not place the microphone near your bed. You do not allow the Wi-Fi signal to penetrate the sleeping quarters. You utilize the heavy gloves of the offline world to strip the copper wires. You build the Faraday cage. You endure the massive massive cognitive and financial friction required to operate an analog home. You accumulate the untracked physical commodities, the heavy metal, and the off-grid energy sources that emit no signal. You let the freezing rain of the physical earth dictate your circadian rhythm, not the blue light of the interface. You do the push-ups in the absolute dark, preserving the density of your bones and the secrecy of your thoughts. The herd will call this extreme. The architect understands that in a grid built on total extraction, the only sanctuary is the one you build out of cold steel. The system wants a population of perfectly audited, sleep-deprived ghosts. The architect builds the impenetrable acoustic fortress, ensuring that the predator's rest remains the only silence the algorithm cannot break. The evolutionary protocol of the human species is currently being systematically sterilized by the presence of the lens. We have reached the coordinate where the biological capacity for propagation is actively deleted from the genome through the mechanism of domestic transparency. In the visceral history of the architect, evolution was a game of absolute high-friction privacy. The survival of the bloodline required the biological nodes to secure a perimeter, eliminate the external gaze, and generate the immense metabolic heat required for reproduction. The 2026 domestic grid has engineered the total systemic drift of this fundamental biological law. You are witnessing the induced extinction of the mammalian drive. The smart home ecosystem is not a convenience. It is a bioacoustic contraceptive. Observe the horrific efficiency of the biometric disruption in the monitored bedroom. The biological imperative to mate requires the absolute shutdown of the threat detection radar. It requires mystery, the absence of the observer, and the primal darkness. The sensorized room eliminates the dark. The basal ganglia of the herd, perpetually aware that the smart speaker is mapping the acoustic data and the mattress is recording the kinetic movement, registers the act of intimacy as a public performance. The physiological mechanisms of reproduction are algorithmically paralyzed. The testosterone required to initiate the high-friction union is chemically suppressed by the underlying cortisol of being watched. The physical capacity to put on the heavy gloves, to endure the push-ups against the cold steel of a hostile reality is rendered impossible when the most primal human act is converted into a data stream. This environment triggers a catastrophic managed demographic collapse. The algorithm replaces the high-entropy, pheromone-driven selection process of natural evolution with the frictionless matching of geolocated biometric profiles. The herd no longer breeds. They transact based on digital compatibility. The offspring of these monitored unions, if they materialize, inherit the epigenetic markers of absolute visibility. They inherit a biological predisposition for performance, a neurological dependence on external validation, and a physiological intolerance for the concept of a secret. The grid is actively terraforming the human species, pruning away the apex traits of the architect, aggression, territorial defense, and silence, and cultivating a monoculture of docile, exhibitionist biomass optimized exclusively for surveillance. The future human is not being evolved. It is being bred to live in a glass cage. The genetic markers for resistance are actively methylated out of existence. Transitioning to the systemic layer, we must confront the final architecture of the biometric enclosure. The traditional financial control of a population required access to their bank accounts. The genius of the domestic grid is the financialization of the resting heart rate. The system has achieved total atmospheric saturation by converting the unconscious human body into a tradable asset. The grid does not need to garnish your wages when it can sell the telemetry of your sleep apnea to the insurance conglomerates. This is the ultimate engine of managed stasis. The smart mattress monitors your rapid eye movement. The acoustic sensors map your coughing. The ambient temperature gauge tracks your inflammation. This data is not encrypted for your health. It is streamed directly to the actuarial tables. A night of disrupted sleep, characterized by high ATP exhaustion and elevated heart rate, results in an immediate, automated increase in your health insurance premium the next morning. The systemic drift ensures that the cost of living expands precisely to consume the vulnerabilities exposed in the bedroom. The financial decisions of the node are driven entirely by the basal ganglia, the terror of the algorithm detecting a weakness. The user cannot relax. The user cannot get sick. The grid extracts their biological data, taxes their exhaustion, and ensures they never accumulate the capital required to afford offline privacy. The slave is not locked in a physical cell. The slave's biological state is monetized at the millisecond scale. The division of classes in the 2026 grid is now exclusively defined by the acoustic profile of the bedroom. Look at the behavior of the solids, the apex predators, the architects who build the data centers. The solids do not sleep inside the scanner. The solids utilize the complex friction of architectural shielding. They embed lead and copper mesh into the drywall. They preserve the cold, unyielding silence of the unmonitored night. They understand that the smart home is a weapon of of mass cognitive destruction deployed against the poor to erase their capacity for rest. The elite exist in the high-friction reality of the dark, acquiring the untracked physical earth, while the liquids are encouraged to dissolve their private lives into the cloud, ensuring that their exhausted bloodlines leave no financial or genetic wake in the history of the species. To survive the systemic grinder, the architect must abandon the ethical delusions of the herd and adopt the absolute mechanics of the predator. The system is designed to liquidate the private sanctuary. The moralist begs for data protection laws. The architect recognizes this as the highest application of the aggression premium. If the herd is willingly purchasing the surveillance devices and paying the monthly subscription for their own panopticon, the architect must be the one who owns the patents. You do not participate in the monitored sleep. You endure the massive cognitive and financial friction required to operate a totally disconnected home. You accumulate the untracked land, the physical gold, the heavy metal, and the off-grid energy sources that power the silence. You let the freezing rain of the physical earth dictate the security of your perimeter. You utilize the predictability of the exhausted masses. If the algorithm dictates the insurance rates of the herd based on their insomnia, the architect shorts their longevity. The herd will call this invasive. The architect understands that in a grid built on total extraction, the only sanctuary is the one you build out of silence. The grid wants a population of perfectly audited, sleep-deprived ghosts. The architect builds the impenetrable acoustic redoubt, ensuring that the predator's bloodline remains the only entity capable of closing its eyes. The terminal coordinate of the privacy timeline does not conclude with the installation of a camera in the bedroom. It concludes with the complete architectural erasure of the room itself. In the year 2036, the concept of the private sleeping quarter has been mathematically liquidated. You are observing a planetary containment geometry where the human subconscious has been successfully classified as public domain real estate. The extraction grid has achieved the absolute unobstructed access to the final perimeter of the human psyche. The 2036 nodes do not go to sleep, they log in. The transition from a sovereign biological entity requiring rest to a hardwired processor awaiting a nightly data dump is complete. At the visceral baseline, the physical entity of the 2036 user is a study in structural foreclosure. The high-density bioracks that have replaced the domestic bedroom are not designed for comfort. They are designed for maximum conductive efficiency. The human host is stripped of the heavy gloves and the physical armor of the day, submerged into a temperature-controlled, conductive gel matrix that links the nervous system directly to the server. This state induces a catastrophic, permanent level of ATP exhaustion. The cellular energy is not utilized for physical recovery. The musculoskeletal system is bypassed. The physical capacity for aggression, the ability to execute the push-ups in the dark, to generate the kinetic force required to resist the cold steel of the environment, has been completely bred out of the meat. The nodes are structurally liquid. They do not shiver in the freezing rain. Their bone density is compromised to the point of structural failure. They are stationary biobatteries, kept physically inert so that 100% of their remaining metabolic heat can be harvested to power the neuroacoustic interface. The neurological reality of this terminal epoch represents the ultimate execution of cognitive strip mining. The phenomenon of the organic, unmonitored dream has been extinguished. In 2036, the grid initiates the REM stage extraction protocol. As the prefrontal cortex powers down and the defenses of the conscious mind drop, the algorithm bypasses the ocular nerves and injects the code directly into the basal ganglia. This is the absolute zero of neural rot. The systemic drift has evolved from tracking behavior to synthesizing. The grid injects hyper-targeted, algorithmic hallucinations into the sleeping mind. The user is force-fed a stream of immersive synthetic desires, a status trap of epic proportions played out in the subconscious. The fear of poverty, the desire for the approved product, the absolute submission to the state, these are not learned behaviors, they are nightly downloads. The internal monologue, the last bastion of human resistance, is annihilated by the total lack of silence. The concept of the secret is biologically impossible when your deepest terrors and primal urges are logged on a corporate ledger before you even wake up. The brain suffers a complete collapse of its immune system. The capacity for crystallization, the ability to form an independent, contrarian thought against the entropy of the mass mind, is deleted because the raw material of thought is no longer generated by the host. The mind is just an empty vessel, wiped clean every morning, ready to execute the directives installed the night before. The evolutionary ledger closes in this dark, humming silence. The demographic that accepted the initial surveillance of the 2020s has reached its genetic termination. The 2036 nodes possess no capacity for human connection because they possess no internal territory to share. They are transparent to the point of invisibility. They will expire in their bioracks, their remaining biological matter recycled into the coolant systems, leaving no physical or cultural wake. The system has consumed the host from the inside out. The architects of 2036 inhabit the terrifying high-friction reality of the unmonitored Earth. A decade prior, we recognized the smart home as the foundation of the slaughterhouse. We refused the sedation. We preserved the absolute friction of the offline night. We stood in the freezing rain to build the readouts out of heavy metal and cold steel. We did the push-ups against the crushing weight of the surveillance grid. We put on the heavy gloves to rip the sensors out of the walls. Now the architects are the only entities left who possess the capacity to close their eyes and see their own dreams. We are the solids. We operate in the absolute dark. We own the server farms that process the nightmares of the herd. The algorithm manages the transparent masses. The architect manages the algorithm. The herd surrendered their subconscious for the illusion of convenience. The predator utilized that submission to secure the eternal silence of his own bloodline. The grid is locked. The extraction is complete.